So it just quickly introduce for our audience. Now that we have four people talking here, we have four voices then to pick out and figure out what they sound like. We're going to introduce the person to our left. So I'm going to have Paul start.
And the person to the left.
Person
Paul,
to my left.
Do you want me to give you just a quick overview
of who
I
he
am
is?
and what I do?
Yeah, please tell me. Who are you again? Do I really start?
Yeah, just the basics. Go for it.
So the man to my left is Mr. Nate Shakles, husband, father, teacher of the year, hunter, gatherer, just an all-around amazing guy. I don't try to think what else to say.
Shankles is pretty fun to say.
One of my coworkers thought for a whole year that my last name was Shanko. But anyways, the man to my left is Kyle Goodwin, preacher, owner of 673 pomegranate trees, several grapes, father, husband, and generally decent guy.
Generally. Well, look at that. That's as good as it's going to get.
I can't get into specifics, but generally.
And I'm sitting next to John Bradford, our Swiss Army man. He, let's see, he's moving right now, and I'm trying to think: has he moved more into different houses, or moved to different jobs more than the time I've known him? Jobs, probably, yeah. But that's just where he's acquired his massive skill set, and very, very useful person as a preacher. He's the kind of guy that every preacher wants 2 or 3 of.
Well, that's glowing recommendation there. Look at that. And to my left...
And he's a ginger.
As I mentioned. And to my left, we have Paul Nerlin, father, big man on campus for the county. What do you enjoy? Man, do you even do any recreation yourself?
He likes hiking.
He does like hiking. He is hiking.
Hiking.
But see how that just slipped out? He likes hockey, right?
I thought it was hockey. Hockey and hiking.
Hiking while I hike.
It happens.
Huge Calgary Flames fan. Husband, father, elder of the congregation here in Clovis, California. All right, that was fun. Now I got my mics all dialed in. Welcome to the Exhorter podcast, where we aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. Kyle, you have our topic this morning.
Well, John, one of the things that we try to emphasize on the Exhorter podcast is modeling Christian conversations. And certainly one of the most potentially contentious conversation topics out there is politics. Especially right now, when we're in that political cycle where we're gearing up for a presidential election, we're in the primaries this year, and 2024 is going to be all about presidential election nonstop. You're going to be hearing politics all the time. It's going to be coming up. And I imagine just like 4 years ago, this is probably going to be the most important election in your lifetime. So it seemed like an important topic to discuss today. The first thing I really want to get into is how do you handle these conversations? Have you ever been involved in a conversation about politics that just got out of hand way fast? Before you even realized it, the conversation got out of control and heated emotions. Have you ever noticed that people tend to get really invested into these conversations? How do you manage those situations? What do you do to try and cool off the temperature on a hot political conversation?
To be perfectly honest, I'm usually the one who's getting heated. So I teach history and economics, and so political topics come up often, and I get passionate about them because I believe in some of them pretty strongly, and so sometimes I have to catch myself and go, "Oh, just back off just a little bit, Nate. It's not that important." So I'm not usually the one saying, "Hey, let's calm down." I'm usually the one who's saying, "Here's the point."
Are we trying to provoke some conversation or maybe trigger some thinking about a topic? Trying to get them to think about it in a different way, or maybe you're antagonizing, provoking, but not necessarily in an antagonistic way.
I'll give an example of somebody who I'm like Nate. I mean, I don't care what position I'm in. If you're passionate about something, it's fun to talk about it. But in my youth, especially entering the workplace, I remember working with a woman who politically completely disagreed with me, and she was very strong personality, very outgoing. And so I loved to put her on the spot and get her kind of flustered. And so I would come in, and at the time, Rush Limbaugh was fairly new and very, very popular.
He was on the radio for like 50 years, dude.
You're dating yourself, Paul.
Yeah, I know. Okay, well, this is like the early 90s, and he was still hitting it big, right? So I would come in and say, well, about 98% of what Rush says, I think you agree with. And she just, what? No, I don't. And she, and of course, did I enjoy that? I did. I have to admit it. Now, we had a good relationship, but I've seen other situations where there's kind of let me drop a bomb and see if I can get an argument going. And so maybe the question is your motivations. To Nate's point, if you're talking about politics, but it's in the vein of something you believe as a Christian and you're sharing your faith, well, that's a different matter. You're not going to stop regardless. But if my motivations are, especially now, maybe today it's more on social media, let me drop a bomb and just see what you're all going to say about it and see if I can get something going. That may be the other question of how you handle politics as a Christian.
Yeah, I think intention really matters, because when you do that online, you're not really wanting to win someone over. Otherwise you would completely approach it a different way.
Yeah, I generally don't like to share political stuff on social media because usually I see social media, it's two people each entrenched in their own side, lobbing grenades at each other. No one's really listening. No one's really even effectively communicating. You're just sharing some video or some article.
Well, actually, you're sharing someone else's point of view. If you're sharing a different article, or, you know what I mean? You're just promoting someone else's perspective on that through something else versus reading the laws or reading that thing yourself and come to your own conclusion.
Well, there's not much dialogue there. There's just, I'll say my point, you say your point, but we're not going to listen. We're not going to talk. I don't find Facebook or any social media to be a really productive means of conversation, really about anything. If I'm going to have a serious conversation about a contentious topic, I want to do it face to face. I'm not interested in engaging through social media. Maybe some of you listeners have had different experiences. That's just, in my experience, I just haven't seen it play out in a very profitable fashion very often.
Nate, okay, so you're similar like me in the sarcasm. Have you ever responded to someone on social media?
You're sarcastic?
I know, whatever. And no one was taking you the right way at all. Like, I mean, that's I have the problem with that. If I ever respond to something on social media, everyone takes everything I say completely literal, and my personality doesn't really come across digitally.
I stopped posting things on social media about a decade ago. So I can't even remember the last time I posted a contentious topic or responded to a contentious post on social media. But I agree with Kyle. It's like two people yelling at each other and neither of them are listening.
Now, it takes a lot of willpower because it's very often that I see somebody share something. And I'm like, oh, that's very ignorant, or they're wrong. And I want to step in and say something. But I tell myself, no, it's not going to help. If you see that person in person and it comes up in conversation, talk about it. But I have to tell myself often, it's not going to go the way you think it will. They're not going to listen to you. They're not interested in your perspective. I just find those conversations are best in person. John makes a good point that usually it's hard to convey emotion or sarcasm or other subtle parts of the communication through written word.
And you don't always have the ability to avoid it, though. Paul and I monitor the church's social media. And so, when you're kind of monitoring a public forum or social media, you have to respond to things. And I just let Paul do it. Okay, so Paul has this knack for approaching people who have something to say, but diffuse the situation. I think that's a lot of your experience, your training, your professional life blended with that too. But you definitely have a little bit more of a knack than I do when it comes to answering those. So I just let you handle it.
Although I've confessed to John, I think on this podcast, that there's been a time
late
or
at
two
night sitting there
where I was on there and they responded, and I just did not want the last word to not be mine. And I remember Londa looking at me saying, "What are you doing?" I literally had to keep looking to say, "Well, did they respond? Did they respond?" So I think the same thing happens in political conversation. It's the desire to be right instead of just having a dialogue and talking. But Kyle, your question was about politics in general and kind of how we engage in that as a Christian. So are you how do you differentiate? Nate was talking about engaging in things he believes in or is passionate about with the students. How do you differentiate your faith from politics? Is that kind of where you're going with?
Well, perhaps this begs a more important or fundamental question. Why do we view politics as such an important conversational topic? Why is it so important to us? Why do we, I mean, I avoid conflict as much as I can. That's just in my nature. But why am I willing to have a confrontational encounter with someone about politics? Why is it so important to us? Is there some connection between our faith and our political beliefs or political leanings? And as a Christian, where do we draw that line between, Peter talks about us in his letters as pilgrims and sojourners, reminding us that as an alien, our citizenship is in heaven and not here. Does that mean we become totally disconnected from the politics of this world? Is that the goal or objective? Or is there some connection? Is there some overlap between our political beliefs and our faith? And that's why it becomes such an intense topic and something we get so defensive about.
So, Kyle, as you were talking, I was thinking that politics can be so contentious because, well, same thing with religion is because it hits close to home with our values.
Well, yes. Is abortion, is it a political issue or is it a religious issue?
Can I yell into the mic? Just kidding. Yeah, right. It crosses both those lines, and it really gets down to who I am as a person, my viewpoint on that, and that's a sensitive issue. I think sometimes I forget that the more important thing is not whether or not they come to believe my political views, but that I have some sort of positive influence on them for Christ. That they would not see me as an enemy politically, or just in general because we have different political views, but that they would see me as a person who, oh, Nate is a genuinely decent guy who's willing to listen. He and I might disagree, so that I could still potentially have some sort of influence on them. And I tend to forget that because I'm more concerned with, I think it was Paul who said, we're concerned with being right. But I think that's the more important thing is having influence.
I think I need specific examples here. It's really hard to talk about politics in a general because you just brought up abortion, and that feels like it's a lot different topic than we're talking about how our taxes are spent, unless they're spent on abortion clinics. But you know what I mean? Like we're talking about
taxation is theft.
Okay. But we're talking, when it comes to social issues, I think I have a little bit more of my faith intermixed with those things. When it comes to fiscal or, these kinds of things, when it comes to the local city governments and state governments, I mean, everyone's leaving California right now because of the politics of California. I just don't have that within me to say, I'm going to let the politics of this state affect where I live and where I move to,
Well, I think there's two sides to it. Kyle's talking about it, engaging or talking about politics, but as Christians, we live in the world and we can't completely separate ourselves. So, when we're I remember having conversations with a brother in Christ who revealed with me their party allegiance that was kind of family based, and said, well, yes, I've been with, this has been, my father was, my grandfather was, and that's our party affiliation. And at the time I was so angry with him because the only thing I could think of was the things that party was aligned with. And I thought, how could you as a Christian do that? He gave his reasons. But I think for us, there's two sides. Are we trying to change hearts? Nate, as you said, what's our motivation? Because that's the first thing. You could pass every law and it doesn't change hearts on the matter. At the same time, as Christians, we shouldn't stand back and not speak for what we believe in and certainly vote for what we believe in, because our children and our grandchildren are reaping that right now. my kids are coming home from school and I'm still in shock at the stuff that they're having to deal with that I didn't. That is because of what has been allowed, frankly, because of politics. So I think there's a balance, but you cannot isolate yourself from politics. There are pieces of it as a Christian that I think we are responsible to be aware of, vote, and talk about in a way to change hearts. That's just my opinion.
Where do you, the listener, where do you draw the line as far as mixing politics with faith, and where does it become important to you that you have to carry on the conversation or hold the line versus I'm going to let that go? For me, I think it boils down to what is the main issue? Like we brought up abortion. It's political by its very nature, but it's also, to me, largely about questions of faith. Are we made in the image of God? When does life begin? Do we have an obligation to protect the most vulnerable? And to all those, I say, yes, we are created in God's image, and life begins from the very beginning. And I think we should. The Bible always emphasizes widows and orphans, the poor, the downtrodden. Go read the minor prophets, and that's what God is angry about in all of those books. The lack of justice and the abuse of the poor, so that the rich become richer at their expense. So there's always this emphasis on protecting. So I want to emphasize the parts that matter about the Bible, that matter about my faith, and maybe de-emphasize the voting aspect of it. But understand that it's still, it has one foot in both sides of the conversation, politics and religion, that there's that overlap. But I'm just going to choose to emphasize one side of it as well. Because, Paul, you brought up a really good point. Something I thought about as a teenager, in the early 2000s. It's still an issue today, but it's taken on a little bit different shape. But gay marriage was really the big thing that was talked about in presidential elections and in the political conversations. And even from an early age, I thought about it and wondered, how should I vote when I become old enough? Does this matter? On the one hand, I thought, what in the world does the government have to do with regulating marriage in the first place? And then that helped me realize you might change the law, but have you changed anyone's heart? So you can vote your conscience. If you think something should be a law, I won't tell you to vote one way or another on it. But I also realize that, let's say we get a law that bans any kind of marriage other than one man and one woman. Has that really changed the heart of someone who is say a homosexual? Has that done anything to save their soul? No, I can't use politics as a substitute for the work I'm supposed to do as the salt and light of this world, or trying to go and save those lost souls.
So Kyle, how do you have that conversation with someone where you believe, marriage is between a man and a woman, and they believe that it's not? It can be between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. How do you have that conversation with them?
Well, that's a tough conversation, and it's one you have to go into realizing they're probably not going to like how this conversation goes. But I need to say what I need to say.
And it's a different conversation if you're having it to someone who is in that population versus someone who just empathizes with and doesn't want to judge anyone, which I think that's the political climate of today. Is people just don't want to be the one to judge people. And so they want everyone to have equality. And so they don't want to be seen as, someone who's judgmental or who has anger towards people. And so they vote politically that way, or they empathize and they kind of advocate for that. And I feel like that's the political climate we're in right now.
Well, and that's where I want to de-emphasize the politics. Is the conversation is going to feel political, but I'm not going to emphasize the voting side of it. I'm not going to emphasize the legal definition of marriage side of it. I'm going to emphasize the scripture and come in with Bible verses to show my beliefs and try and reach them and appeal to them through the word of God, not necessarily through politics.
Well, I think you can probably have a conversation about, if a law is passed, does it change your perspective on something or the reality of something? Or are you just waiting for that law to be overturned 4 years later? when it comes to marriage, it doesn't change God's view of marriage. Just because the law says someone can get married, that law is different than God's law. The state and local laws are different than God's law. Does God recognize that marriage? No.
Well,
even though we do as a state local government.
And what if the government comes back and says, we're done in the marriage business. We're not going to regulate it anymore. No more marriage licenses. It's entirely a civil union. You do what you want to do. So does that mean I'm suddenly not married to Jessica
anymore? Is that more
anymore?
libertarian? Is that where is that? It probably would be, right?
See, you're trying to steer this in a political direction.
I thought we were having political conversations as Christians. But I mean,
was it my taxation is theft comment?
It's probably that. But
gave me up.
I think it's
that's why marriage is a government regulated thing in the first place, so that they can regulate taxes, so they can give more taxes. Yeah. All right. Sorry, John.
I think it's different for people who think that the government should be there to make up for what we don't do as far as helping people, helping the poor, helping the people who are levied against.
Well, that's getting back to an earlier point that I think should be emphasized again. We can vote and be involved. My beliefs, I think we can and even should be involved with the government and the laws of this country. We should be involved with voting and electing officials, but we should never look at that as the replacement for action. We could be pro-life, and if your conscience leads you to vote that way, and if I think that's the biblical view that all life is sacred and in the image of God and should be protected, therefore I vote that way. You might feel like you should vote one way and vote a way that reflects your faith, but don't let that become a substitute for action. You might vote pro-life, but are you doing something about it as well? Are you
standing up for your belief?
Yeah. Are you standing up for your beliefs? You might vote pro-life, but are you actually living that kind of lifestyle? Are you supporting organizations like Sacred Selections? Are you doing things in your life that show that, rather than just voting and letting the government handle it or thinking I did my job and voted the way my faith? You need to actually live out your faith in action.
Just one thought, and being the anti-government guy who works in government, that's me.
Ron Swanson.
Yeah. I have seen a lot of situations in my job where churches are actually involved in politics, literally endorsing candidates, coming out on a particular political issue, or actively involved in what they would call social justice type issues. And so what does that mean? What happens to those churches, and sometimes the view of those churches is they're now viewed as partisan. They're not viewed as the Church of Christ, which is above it all. So it's interesting, as I've seen that they're now viewed as part of this camp instead of above it all. So that's just something else to think about is, if a church gets into, let's just say they endorse a candidate and that candidate fails or that candidate has moral failures, sometimes that church is now looked upon differently because of their poor judgment on an issue, a candidate per se. So just something else to think about when it comes to how that's done. So if a church is coming out endorsing a candidate, Kai, you were alluding to it earlier. The last presidential election, we're looking at two choices and thinking, I remember my kids asking me, Dad, what are you going to do?
Every presidential election in my lifetime has felt that way.
I'm old enough to remember, sometimes when it was better than it is today, when there was actually, some candidates that seemed a little more respectful, but they weren't perfect either. Just we probably didn't know everything at the time. So just something to think about. Churches that get so engaged that they're no longer looked on with the holiness that probably we should look on God because, hey, they're part of the political system. It's been interesting to watch.
And that's what we have to combat out there. As if we have conversations with people who are not of like faith, there are so many bad examples of this. There are churches like that who get involved in politics. There's churches who, or groups of so-called Christians who do acts of violence out there in groups. And there's people who storm a Capitol and quote scripture while doing it. And so if you believe in scripture, you are then now a part of the same camp. You are now aligned with people who believe in all those things. And I think that's the problem with being very vocal about politics is you are immediately linked with those types of people because you have now merged the two, where it's a lot smarter to separate those two, like you said, and not be lumped in with all the bad. We talked about this with the high school group, and I showed a bunch of clips of politicians quoting scriptures from actual committee proceedings. They had no idea what they were quoting, like most of the time that they're using, it's like the 2 Corinthians bit, right? They're just kind of using words to rally constituents, right? Who are faith-based. They're trying to rally those people. And so we had a lot of these conversations about, should Christians be involved in politics? Should they run for office? How far and how deep can you get in that world? And it was really interesting.
Well, going back to the attitude that Nate, you started, and Kyle, you finished, about maybe an attitude of humility, but then also trying to understand. I remember Ed Harrell was one of those preachers that was both one of the smartest and funniest guys that I ever listened to.
He's forgotten more than I'll ever learn.
Yeah, and he would say that, right? But he used to say something about church politics and church disagreement, and he would say facetiously, well, you know what the church needs to do to really resolve all this? Just put me in charge. That would solve it all. And of course, he was being facetious, but I think in politics, we think the same thing, which is an arrogant thing to say, well, I could be there, I would solve it. These issues that we're dealing with in politics are not simple. And so trying to understand is certainly a key part of it, but also just coming at it with humility.
And maybe get off YouTube and don't watch these 2-hour-long programs of angry people that make their living off of saying angry things. That'd probably help you a little bit too, to not be anxious over politics.
So, can I kind of take this in a little bit different direction?
Oh, we love different directions.
Well, I don't know if it's a different direction or just back to the original.
Pretty bold for your first time on the episode.
Seriously, wow.
Hey, it's not my first time with headphones on and a microphone in front of me, okay? It's my second. But Kyle, your original question was, how do we have conversations about these things? Is that kind of what it was?
Yeah.
Because my thought is, if we're talking about how to have conversations about politics, then I think we're talking about how to have conversations about anything. And I think an important thing to remember in conversations, especially if we as Christians want to have influence on others, is we got to listen. This is probably the hardest thing for me to do, is to listen to the other side and what they believe without interrupting, without interjecting, and without passing that judgment. Because, John, you don't have to say anything. If you and I disagree and you're like bright cherry red, I can tell that you disagree with me. You're passing
Could you
judgment.
Tell if I was bright cherry red?
No, because you're that way all the
yeah.
time. But not passing judgment on what they have to say until they're finished saying it, and actually thinking about what they have to say and why they believe the way they believe, because they believe that way for a reason. What is that reason? And the other thing I would add to that is being curious instead of, I don't know if judgmental is necessarily the right word to use, but being curious initially instead of judgmental, just trying to figure out, why do you have the viewpoint that you have? And here's what I think happens when we do that. One, the other person realizes this is a person who legitimately cares about what I have to say. And that allows us to have more influence on them. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I really think that that's an important thing. And the other thing I would say is ask questions. It goes along with being curious. But the beautiful thing about asking questions, and I think I've learned this as a teacher, is one, I remain in control. If I'm asking the questions, I'm leading you.
Yeah.
And so I can influence them in that way too, by asking questions, not only that help to understand where they're coming from, but would lead them to understand where I'm coming from and what I believe is the truth on the matter. Do I always practice what I preach there? No, but I think that that's, as far as having political conversations with people we agree with or disagree with, listen to what they have to say, be curious, and ask questions, because that'll allow us to lead the conversation in the direction that we think it should go and have more influence.
Well, it's hard for me right now as a preacher to resist the urge to wrap things up with 3 main points.
I thought I just did that.
But no, you introduced point 2. So
okay.
So here's where my mind goes through this conversation in this episode is how to handle and navigate these contentious conversations about politics. For one, de-emphasize the politics. We want to make sure we're getting to the heart of the matter. And if we're going to want people to understand why it's so important to us, we have to use scripture, not necessarily political rhetoric, and understand that here's why. If you think I'm going to vote pro-life, or if you think I'm going to vote this way or vote for this candidate, well, let's try to talk less about the candidate or less about the party and more about here's the reason why. But on the flip side of that, as Nate pointed out, we've got to listen as well. I remember the last election. There were Christians on both sides, and it's easy to get judgmental, or it's easy to think that just because someone has an R or a D in front of their name, you instantly know everything about them, and you can be either entirely in favor of them or entirely dismissive of them. In the last election, as a Christian, how could you possibly vote for someone who is so morally bankrupt and awful? As a Christian, how could you vote for someone who's not pro-life? Well, how do you figure that one out? Maybe you need to talk to them and listen and try to understand. I want to know, why are they on the other side? Why are they lined up on the opposite side of this political conversation? So that's the second point, is be a good listener, ask lots of questions. And Nate made a really good observation there that it keeps you in the driver's seat of the conversation. But third, I think we're all thinking this, but we need to say it. It's helpful to remember politics. It's important now, but in the big picture, I'm talking eternity. It's just not that important when we look at the big picture. In Daniel chapter 2, you get this awesome vision. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and Daniel interprets it. And you guys all know this one. The head of gold, the arms and chest of silver, the legs of bronze, and the feet of iron and clay. And that's all about the world kingdoms. You go through Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. And at the end of this giant stone, not cut by human hands, so it's the work of God, comes and crushes this statue and becomes a great mountain that fills the whole earth. Do you feel that way when you talk about politics, or do you feel like your back's against the wall and we're outnumbered and I'm trying to fight the good fight and it's a losing battle? Remember, you're part of the kingdom that conquers the whole world. You're part of a kingdom that has a king that will sit on the throne forever. And I think it's important to remember that in these conversations, that it might be important now, and it might feel very important that we get this person elected and not this person. We get this law passed, or we get this one overturned by the Supreme Court. And there is some importance to it right here and right now, but just don't forget. One final scripture is in Romans 14 and verse 12. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God in the faith of Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them." Revelation tells a story about people who are outcasts, who are treated poorly in life, and many of them killed for their faith and martyred. But Revelation, in John's vision, they're depicted as victorious, wearing crowns and robes of white. They are on the winning side. I think that's important to keep in mind when we talk about politics as well. It's important, but lowercase I important. Things of God matter most, and my citizenship is in heaven. I'm part of that kingdom that lasts forever, and I want to make sure I'm talking to people about God more than I am politics.
No, I was just gonna. I think that was a great wrap up. And when you mentioned the book of Daniel, it just reminds me of that statement: God rules in the kingdom of men. I have to think at that time, imagine them looking at what was going on and thinking, "What is going on, Lord?" And there, you may be listening to this and looking at what's going on in government or our country and say, "What is going on?" That passage has always comforted me. God's in control. Nothing's going to change that. The importance of politics is the fact that I'm the one not in control of it. He is. He knows what's happening, and I have complete faith in him. So that passage and really the whole book of Daniel is a good reminder of that for me.
Would you rather have something just so that you feel comfortable that aligns with your faith and beliefs, or do you like the laws of the land being very neutral to people's faiths and beliefs so that everyone has a more of an equal playing field? Or would you rather them just completely align to your own?
Like the idea of the separation of church and state.
Anything coming from SCOTUS that just says, or, federal, this is now a law that, governs everyone. Would you rather those be very neutral to people's beliefs on a whole, or would you definitely want them to align with your own?
I don't want them to disalign with my own.
But no matter what, if it aligns with yours, it's going to conflict with a whole lot of others.
This is part of my fear. And, when you get a political opinion, it's usually based on something fundamental to your values. And so that's where we have this hard time separating politics from our faith. The reason why we have such and such a political view is because under the surface, we hold such and such biblical view. And so even with me, when I get on a rant about independents or libertarians and things like that, that's based on something more fundamental in my faith. And part of my fear with this is a type of warfare that I don't think the Christian is set up to win. When you talk about marriage, I would love the government to just get out of marriage and stop regulating it altogether. Because, well, now I don't need to get on a rant.
But our president's flip-flopped on that one. And so we've had lots of politics. That's the thing. Politics, everyone flip-flops based upon where their constituents land or who hired them and who's
whatever the cultural zeitgeist is. Did I use that word correctly?
Yeah. So we are behind the pendulum that way because we do not change our views.
But here's the thing: when we start weaponizing the church to gather signatures for a petition to define marriage in the Constitution as one man and one woman, which is the way it is biblically, we start getting involved in a fight that they're going to take it further. The other side, they're going to fight back, and it's going to keep escalating. Are we ready for that kind of fight when, again, we're not changing anybody on the other side? We aren't appealing to their soul or their conscience. We're just escalating a fight that I don't think Christians are set up to win. Political fights get dirty. And I just think there's a certain level where we need to understand, I want to back out of this. And I want the law to be a reflection of godly values. But what's more important to me is appealing to one person at a time and making a real change in their life rather than just trying to force my views through the government on someone else. And they're just going to reject it. When you pull on you got your dog on a leash, when you pull, he's just instinctively going to pull right back the opposite direction. I think that's what happens with politics. You
essentially aligned with where I was going with that one. Is I would rather the laws be more neutral than completely aligned to my perspective and now make me the target of all that is wrong with everything, because then your influence cannot rise above that. But I would much rather it not be anti my views. I would just rather it be more neutral to and allowing people to have the freedom to believe what they believe and choose what they choose. There's one thing that happened just a while back where my kid said something about Trump, and someone said it was about him being indicted, right? And they didn't understand. Obviously, he's not guilty of this. As fathers, we need to think about how this impacts our kids, our political leanings, and how we kind of mix that with our faith. Because I think a lot of the times they get a lot of these mixed signals from us that it's more important or it's as important as our faith. And I think that that's what we have lots of problems with in this country and in general in the churches that get too involved in this is they've seen this example from the prior generation, and more generations of people become more political. Their kids see that and rise to that level. And I just kind of interested in how you guys think about the impact of your political perspectives on your kids.
Well, your point, John, that's exactly the conversation I was having with my kids. Because, we talked about what we believe, and it was realizing that essentially there are no candidates that align completely as a Christian. I've got choices where they either disagree with what the Bible says with policy that they may put in place, or morally they're demonstrating things in their lives that are not perfect. So I think you bring up a good point. The closer, you don't want them to be aligning that with their faith, because these men or women are going to fail.
Nate, something, I mean, when you said earlier about listening, and then Kyle, you that was your second point there. I remember going through an exercise at work with fellow coworkers, and I put it to myself to come up with 10 things I liked about the other candidate at the time. And so it took me a while, but I was researching and I looked for them, and I actually found 10 things that I actually liked about the opposing candidate, because we were having kind of a little debate in the office. And just that process, I mean, it didn't convict me to vote to switch my view, but just that empathetic process did allow me to listen to why the other person believed the way they believed and what they liked about it. And I think we also said here, a lot of times we vote the way our families vote. And sometimes we hear growing up, this is the party of the people, or this is the party that believes and helps the poor and helps these types of people. And so I think a lot of times we need to give a little grace to people who just haven't sat and critically thought about all the points that a party might hold. And there is no party that you are going to align 100% with all their views.
Well, and when it's a conversation with another Christian that has a different political view than you, that's where we get back to the idea of listen and try and understand. Don't judge them and say, how could a Christian think that? Well, maybe ask the question, how can a Christian think that? I want to know.
One more thing to your point about, do you want policies that are neutral or depend, how will that go? One thing to keep in mind, when did the church grow the most in the New Testament?
Under extreme persecution.
Under extreme persecution. I'm not saying I want persecution so the church will grow. But if you look at even in America, when has the church grown the most? It's been during times of difficulty, times of persecution, and a lot of times it's been during when times are best that we relax and the church shrinks. Just something to think about.
Yeah, my kids are going to have it too easy. We should just vote opposite to our consciences so that it makes it harder for them. They'll work for it.
They'll be meeting underground.
Exactly. You know what? A little struggle. Not too.
Well, just be sure you get out and vote next November. It's the most important election in your lifetime.
Election in your lifetime.
The fate of the free world lies at risk here. So get out and vote. And you know who. For you know who.
Well, Kyle, thank you for this topic. I think we learned a few things of what to do and what not to do. It's a sensitive area, but if you're listening to this and you've wondered where to go, what to do, at the end of the day, God rules in the kingdom of men. Thank you for joining. We hope you'll share this podcast and listen to us and join us next time.
Can we talk about recreational marijuana now?
Did you vote yes on that?
Well, as a libertarian,
if it's not
tax revenue,
whether he did.
If it's not illegal, is it wrong for a Christian?
See, that's what I mean. Man's laws versus God's laws, completely different. Just because it's legal doesn't make it.
Genesis says he gave us every herb.
I was going to say, isn't it in Revelation, doesn't it talk about the leaves of the trees being healing? And
so medicinal. My goodness.
Thank you for listening.
But I guess you don't use the
Exhorter
leaves.
podcast.
I guess it's a different part of the plant.